Yeah, we back. Now, today's gonna be a quick video. I'm gonna be responding to a comment that I got from a respected subscriber. You know, I respect his contributions, and it was actually in my last video. Take a look up on the screen. Ibrahim Traore launches a revolutionary education system. And in that video, I was basically explaining why it's important to indoctrinate your children along the proper socio-cultural values, so when they grow up and become the leaders of tomorrow, the governors of tomorrow, the presidents of tomorrow, the military generals of tomorrow, they are instilled with the proper information and indoctrination to defend the nation with their dying breath. And I drew the correlation between the type of education that we receive as children. And when I say we, I'm talking about young black boys and girls. And I drew the correlation between the type of education we receive and the level of leadership that we have, right? I basically said that you're never going to be able to produce the proper leadership if you are not indoctrinating the children properly when they come up. And I drew the comparison between other nations like the United States and France and things like that. The reason why the leadership in those nations is so patriotic and so nationalistic is because when you examine the education they give to their children, the curriculum they have, the narrative they produce, it's focused on ancestral veneration, the national heroes, giving praise and honor to their forefathers and their ancestors. When you examine their movies and their literature, they produce films and media that glorifies the nation's past, the military might and the so-called democratic values. They don't do what we do. You see, when it comes to us, black boys and girls, they're not given the stories of their ancestors. They're not given the narrative of their ancestors. But when you examine the powerful nations of the world, they glorify their ancestors. They glorify George Washington, even though he was a human trafficker, slave trader. They glorify Thomas Jefferson, even though he was a pedophile rapist. They glorify Napoleon Bonaparte, even though he was a warmonger and a human trafficker. They don't let those flaws and blemishes stop them from venerating their ancestors to the highest degree. But when it comes to us, we do the opposite. We throw our ancestors in the garbage, right? And then we wonder why we don't have the same level of patriotic leadership in our nations and in our countries and in our communities. We don't study the history of our ancient civilizations. We don't even value that history or culture. We don't study the history of what our ancestors went through in depth. We don't really go into it. We study the sanitized version of it, but we don't really go in deep and study the literature because we were never given the literature in the first place. And that's why when I seen this story of how Ibrahim Traore is trying to revamp the entire educational system in the entire region and to reformat it in a way that is actually compatible with the young children, the young black boys and girls growing up in that environment instead of the colonial education they've been receiving, to me, that's one of the most revolutionary actions you can take. Because I've always been of the opinion that if you create young patriotic children, then you will have the patriotic leaders of tomorrow that will defend the nation to their dying breath. Now, I had a subscriber come into the comment section and he made a very interesting contribution. So I want to read that comment and I'm going to respond to it. Take a look up on the screen. He said this: the sellout leaders won't stop until either they fear the people they lead more than the people who are threatening them with exile and assassination for not acting right, or they know the people they lead will do nonstop action to anyone who acts against their life. No amount of education or patriotic thought will stop that because it's not about those things. How many attempts have there been on Traore's life? I really dislike the idea that African leaders just sell out because they don't know any better, and as though there aren't nuclear-powered external forces making threats behind the scenes that everybody pretends aren't there. When it comes to discussions around this topic, people speak as though these leaders are at a table of equals and they make demands and deals, and they walk away from the table with the sellout deal they chose. When the reality of the situation is they are told how to act, and if they don't act in that manner, a gunboat shows up at their port, a coup suddenly happens, or they have a plane crash. Everyone saw what happened to Sankara, to Gaddafi, to Lumumba, and more. And more importantly, they saw how the people responded, never even faced so much as a worthwhile public backlash, a riot, or even grassroots economic consequences. Education and pride in oneself won't solve this particular problem, even if it helps with many others. We've shown any aspiring leader that seeks to make a change that not only is he risking his life, but he will risk his life, and an entire diaspora of people will simply make verbal sounds and typing noises online if he loses his life trying to improve the position of his nation and people and act against a stronger force. Even now, I see people type how they hope nothing happens to Traore instead of what they would do in case something did happen. That doesn't inspire any African leader to fight for his people, as opposed to acquiescing to the demands of a superior power that will take his life with impunity. We're essentially asking these leaders to be our Superman while we do nothing but point and cry when one is shot out of the sky for trying. This is a two-way street, in my opinion. Now, let me respond to that, though I did respond to him when I said you do raise a good argument, but I do want to respond to him in this video. Now, he raised many arguments. He said the first argument he said was that these leaders are not sellouts. He basically said that their hands are tied and they pretty much have no choice in the matter. Now, I disagree with that. I do believe that you do have a choice in the matter and you can take the consequences that come with that. That's a choice, in my opinion. And he also said that the populations themselves do not defend their leaders. He said it's a two-way street because if the leader is assassinated or taken out by foreign powers, then the population themselves has to rise up in defense of their leader. Now, the response I would give to him is this comes back to my original point. You're expecting a patriotic defense and a national mobilization from a population that is chronically miseducated, right? How can you expect the nation to rise up in defense of, for example, Sankara, right? You have a population that was coming out of colonialism, fresh out of colonialism, right? How do you expect them, after decades and decades and decades of colonial education, or sometimes no education at all, how do you expect them to understand the dynamics of geopolitics and the historical dynamics from the past and the present to then launch a mobilization to defend the leader? In my opinion, this still comes back to the original premise of properly educating the population, right? It's only so much you can expect from a population of people that's been chronically induced with religious indoctrination, European colonial education. Yes, it's a two-way street, but you cannot expect the population to have your back if the population is not properly educated on who they are, number one, where they have been, number two, who their enemies are, number three, what their current situation is, number four, and how they got there, and what actions are needed to take to reverse what has happened. So all of that comes back to education, right? All of it comes back to education. And also when it comes to the leaders are a product of the population. Where do the leaders come from? The leaders come from the society. The leaders come from the population. So if the population themselves are chronically miseducated, chronically indoctrinated on false narratives and false premises, then how do you expect to produce the Sankaras and the Lumumbas, etc., etc.? The education that the children are currently receiving, it's not going to produce a Sankara. It's not going to produce a Lumumba, right? It's going to produce an Alassane Ouattara. It's going to produce a Barack Obama. It's going to produce a William Ruto. That is the type of leadership that the current curriculums in education are producing en masse. And every now and again, you might get somebody that slips through the cracks like Ibrahim Traore, but he had to take power by the force of arms. Or then you might get the president from Tanzania, Magufuli, right? Or you might get somebody that falls through the cracks like on accident. But that's not the stereotypical individual that's being produced in these classrooms. And when you examine the average black person, I'm talking about the average. I'm not talking about the anomalies. I'm not talking about the Lumumbas, because that's not the average, right? The average black person is not Patrice Lumumba, right? The average black person is more leaning towards Jesse Lee Peterson, to be honest, right? The average black person walking down the street, right? Go back to the questions I asked before. Do they know who they are? Do they know where they have been? Do they know how their people got to where they are today? Do they know what to do to reverse what has happened? Do they know who their ancestral enemies are? And for the average black person, they're going to answer most of those questions with no, I do not know. I don't know. I was never informed. I have no idea. Right? So that's the average person. So the leadership has to come from the population. So on average, you're going to get a person who doesn't know who they are, doesn't know where they have been, doesn't know who their enemies are, doesn't know how they got to where they are today, and doesn't know what to do to reverse the situation. Now, of course, these men are educated in, math and science and economics, and they hold high degrees, and they're very educated in other areas. But when it comes to their cultural education, are they informed on who they are and where they have been, and do they value their culture to the same degree as these leaders of other nations? No, they do not, because as children, the indoctrination started early and they never received a proper education, right? And I gave you the example of the Jewish child. From a very young age, the Jewish child knows who he is. He knows where he has been. He knows what has happened to his people, the atrocities his people has faced. He knows how they got to where they are today, and he is informed from a very young age to make sure that never happens again. You cannot say the same thing for the black child. So yes, I do agree with what he said. But like I said, if the population en masse is not being educated in the proper fashion, you're not going to get the proper leaders that are going to be able to do battle against our enemies, and you're not going to have the population to defend them when they go and make the decision to defend the nation, right? So yes, it's a two-way street, but it always comes back to education, in my opinion. You have to educate the children. You have to educate the babies, man. You have to make sure the babies know who they are, They're connected with their ancestors. They know what their ancestors went through. They know how they got to where they are today. They know who their enemies are, who committed harm against them, and they are properly informed on what to do to make sure it never happens again. When you create a population that is properly indoctrinated along these lines, then you will have an endless supply of leadership to rise to power, to place in power, and to defend the nation. In order to defend something, you have to value it. The type of education we receive, and it doesn't matter where you are on the planet, the young black boy and girl is not being taught to value their culture. It's not being taught to value their heritage, to value their ancestors, to value who they are as a people. So you're not going to defend what you don't value. You have to be taught to value these things. We're not taught to value these things. So of course, we're not going to have the proper leadership. It doesn't matter where you are. The narrative that we're given as children, it teaches us to value things that are outside of us. That's why we view it as a status symbol to go to the fancy white university, to live in the fancy white neighborhood, to drive the fancy white man's car, to wear the fancy white man's garments. Because we are taught to value these things, right? We're miseducated to value the wrong things. You're not gonna defend what you don't value. So if you don't value yourself, you're never gonna defend yourself. So yes, he does make a good point on how, yes, when you do get a patriotic leader, the outside forces, the enemies are gonna mobilize against us. But the leaders come from the population, and the population themselves are not properly indoctrinated or educated. So the leaders themselves it's not going to be any different. It's not going to be any different. If you elect Jesse Lee Peterson to the head of an African country, you think he's going to be trying to defend? No, he's going to be selling out. He's going to be giving out concessions. He's going to be giving out mines, and he's going to be giving away natural resources. He's going to be selling the country away because he has been totally miseducated. I'm using him as an example, right? But I would probably think that the average African leader is more closer to Jesse Lee Peterson than Patrice Lumumba, to be honest, right? So anyways, I'm not gonna make this video too long, man. This is what never called. That's Salim back in the Billy. Yes, indeed. Cash App in the description. Support the album, man. Support the album. Peace.
No. Feel like I'm 75. Know that your team be full of them traders. You know that can never be mine. I'm grabbing a thought when I drive. I'm back in my zone and we young. She said that she ready to come be my wife. Yeah, hoping I don't do her wrong. I gave her my word and it's bond. I'm whipping the best like a lamb. I'm eating no chicken and lamb. Accustomed to call me the man. I never be up on the gram. I'm keeping that way undercover. She want me to tell her I love her. I told her I'm breaking the rules. I told her we making the news. Back in my city, they loving me. Standing alone, I'm 100 deep. Enemy plotting and still in reach. They try to make sure that we underneath. Trying to make sure that we never make it. Coming for power, come get acquainted. Coming for everything that I wanted. Feeling like Drake, but I really wrote it. Feeling like Kendrick, I'm checking names. Gotta roll up while I go insane. Got so much stress, I been gained weight. Stuffing these racks in this Louis case. One thing for certain, I'm about to check. Keep it 100 and nothing less. Stick with the family since day one. Had to stay down till my day come. Had to stay down, but I'm never patient. Hop on the mic and I'm motivated. Hop on the mic and I drive a classic. Haters can't see me, they copping glasses. Back in the studio making magic. Got a new tape and it's in production. Back on my business, I got a budget. Staying low key when I'm out in public. Feel like I'm 75. Know that your team be full of them traders. You know that can never be mine. I'm grabbing a thought when I drive. I'm back in my zone and we young. She said that she ready to come be my wife. Yeah, hoping I don't do her wrong. I gave her my word and it's bond. I'm whipping the best like a lamb. I'm eating no chicken and lamb. Accustomed to call me the man. I never be up on the gram. I'm keeping that way undercover. She want me to tell her I love her. I told her I'm breaking the rules. I told her we making the news.